the US and other countries would like China to do, right? They would like to see the Chinese currency appreciate. They'd like to see China rely less on exports. They'd like to see it depend more on its own internal markets. Another option is to intervene to stop the currency from rising, right? So what you do is you buy dollars and you sell your local currency. Remember, we saw reserves going up in all of these countries. That's what a lot of countries have been doing. But you can't do that forever. What happens when you buy a lot of foreign reserves? One thing it does is it pushes liquidity into your financial system. As liquidity goes up, what can happen to prices? Prices start to go up. So what have we been seeing in the last year in countries like China, in many parts of Latin America? We've seen inflation beginning to return with a vengeance, right? Inflation is going up very, very dramatically, so much so that China just announced this week its third interest rate increase, trying to dampen domestic monetary growth. And then the third option, and one that everybody has been talking about, is to impose capital controls or taxes to try to staunch the flow of money into the country. So one very important question, and one that policymakers all over the world are asking right now, is do these types of capital controls work? Are they effective? And there's a lot of research on this, and I think the general answer is that controls on capital inflows generally are not terribly effective. They don't stop a flow of money into the country. At best, if you design controls like Chile did during much of the 1990s, you may alter the composition of capital so you have more long-term flows rather than short-term flows. But there's no evidence that controls on capital inflows alone work. And moreover, countries that put in place controls don't have fewer financial crises. The only set of policies that work is if you put in place controls both on inflows and outflows of capital of the sort that India and China have in place. So for most countries, this is not practical. Once you've opened up your financial markets, it's very difficult to try to close everything down again. So this is not really a realistic policy for most countries. So instead, I'm not going to get into the technical details because I'm...
You're welcome.
No, I'm not.
So interesting.
What people have been talking about instead is to try to find a way to put, it's an expression from John Maynard Keynes, is to put sand in the wheels, right? So you can try to do things like put in place controls on banks so that they can't borrow as much from international sources. You may increase reserves on banks so that they will have less of an incentive to borrow from abroad. These policies, have been seen to work, somewhat in some countries, not so much in others. Korea right now is following this policy of trying to implement these kind of what we call pro-cyclical prudential regulations. So we'll see if they're going to be very effective, but the jury's still out. And the other thing that you could try to do is to assist the export sector by providing cheap credit. So that's a set of policies that have been tried in many countries. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm going to skip back. Oh, I'm going in the wrong direction. Okay. So let's move on and talk about so the currency wars began. We have these set of issues that emerged. We have people beginning to discuss these policies. So in their typical fashion, leaders from around the world said, okay, at the G20 meetings in Seoul, Korea, we're going to resolve all of these issues. We're going to get together, sit down, in a spirit of cooperation. We're going to work all these things out. and it didn't turn out so great. So there were a number of issues that really emerged at this summit. And I want to focus especially, well, I'll talk about all of them, okay? So the first is the United States did something very interesting, right? So I told you they were pressuring China to reduce its surpluses, to allow the value of its currency to appreciate, and it wasn't getting anywhere. So somebody in the US Treasury Department came up with a great idea. Well, if we can't get them to change the value of their currency, maybe what we can do is try a backdoor approach. So the US proposed all countries in the world should agree to limit their surpluses or deficits to 4% of their GDP. Right? So they're thinking, right, well, if China has to reduce its surplus below 4%, the only way it's going to be able to do that is by allowing its currency to appreciate. So aren't we clever? We can get China to do what we want through this kind of a backdoor channel. The reception to this policy was not very good, right? Germany immediately said, also running a surplus, no way, no how, this is a horrible idea. China came out very quickly and said, we will not agree to this. Maybe you, United States, should have the 4% limit on your deficit, but when we have a surplus, we're a virtuous country, we're not running deficits, so we don't need to do this. So it didn't really go anywhere. There was very strong opposition to the US policy of quantitative easing too, so much so that the US, I think, was quite taken aback. And this kind of opposition has really continued to this day. So last week, many commentators who are critical of US policy came up with a very interesting argument. They said that this policy is behind the recent surge in food prices, right? Because food prices are often denominated in dollars, the value of the dollar is depreciating. US policy has been leading food prices to go up dramatically in value. Some people went as far as to say, Ben Bernanke, you have blood on your hands, right? This conflict in Tunisia, in Egypt, which has been partly sparked by unrest, by people who are angry over food prices, they said, ultimately goes back to this policy that the US put in place, right? Now, I think that's the wrong argument. When you look at why food prices have gone up, it has more to do with bad weather that hits the world the last year. So you had the drought in Russia and much of Central Asia. You have floods in Australia. So I don't think this argument is correct. But it shows the kind of vehemently strong opposition that there is to U.S. policy.
But China agrees and appreciates its currency. It's not going to have similar effect in this case on inflation. Consumption, so if they have a stronger currency, it means that their people can buy more, so consumption will increase, and it's not going to lead to the same problem, I mean, regarding inflation?
Well, China's experiencing inflation right now primarily for a couple of reasons. One is that demand is very high, right? So the economy is really overheating and overstimulated. But the other reason is that China has accumulated so many foreign reserves and is finding it very difficult to sterilize the increase that implies for the money supply. So there might be an impact on food prices if China were to appreciate its currency because it would be able to import more. So there might be somewhat higher demand. But if China had a more balanced approach, the kind of lessening of global imbalances would probably have a more salutary effect on food prices. So I don't see a very, very strong link there. Okay. The other issue that really appeared very strongly was how quickly countries in the world should begin to put their fiscal houses in order. Right? So as part of this crisis, as we saw, many countries ran a fiscal stimulus. In many countries, we see very large government deficits and growing deficits. So one of the big debates there was, when should countries begin to reimpose fiscal discipline? And there was a very, very strong divide there between countries like Germany that said, impose discipline now, and countries like the United States that said, no, if you do so too quickly, then you may stop growth, and as a result, we're not going to see a return to like a stronger world economy. And then finally, there was the issue of how serious inflation was, right? So how quickly were countries to move from providing ample credit to beginning to cut back and putting in place a more kind of conservative set of monetary policies. So in developed countries, basically the answer was, no, we don't need to do this right now. It would be very dangerous. There's a risk of deflation. In developing countries already beginning to see inflationary pressures, there was more pressure to try to stop inflation now. I'll escape that. Maybe I won't. I'm just thinking that I've already spoken for an hour, so in a way I've covered most of the issues, so maybe I should give a chance for discussion.
Yeah, you should shift to answer the
Yeah.
question.
And you all have the handout, so you'll have a chance to look over. I've really covered most of the points. All I would be doing is going in more detail. So I'm happy to answer questions on those things or anything else, or any question that you might have.
Okay, dear colleagues, I think we all